In a tectonic development that could have far-reaching ramifications for the country, Israel's parliament, known as the Knesset, on Monday ratified the first bill of a highly controversial judicial overhaul sought by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his far-right allies. This after last-ditch compromise efforts collapsed and failed to ease a constitutional crisis that has been convulsing the country for months. The amendment limiting the Supreme Court's powers to invalidate any government decisions if it deemed them unreasonable was passed by a 64-0 vote after opposition lawmakers walked out in protest. Soon after, Prime Minister Netanyahu, in his address to the nation, claimed, "Fulfilling the will of the voters is by no means the end of democracy, it is the essence of democracy." He termed the passage of the law a necessary democratic move and blamed the opposition for refusing to compromise. Netanyahu also urged military reservists who've been protesting not to refuse to serve. There have been unprecedented protests across Israel against Netanyahu's highly polarizing plan to reshape the country's judicial system. The large-scale protests have exposed deep fissures in the Israeli society. The vote, which came after a storming session with opposition lawmakers storming out, reflects the determination of Netanyahu and his ruling coalition to move ahead with the plan, which has tested the delicate social ties that bind Israel, have rattled the cohesion of its powerful military, and repeatedly drawn concern from its closest ally, the United States. During this vote, lawmakers approved a measure that prevents judges from striking down government decisions on the basis that they are unreasonable. Supporters of the legislation say unelected judges have had excessive powers over decision-making by elected officials. But critics of the government say this new law removes a key element of the court's oversight powers and opens the way for corruption and improper appointments. The protesters feel the very foundations of their country are being eroded. The government's plan, in fact, is headed in that direction, they say. As we said, thousands of military reservists too have declared their refusal to serve under the Netanyahu government for taking steps which they see as setting the country on a path to dictatorship. Former Prime Minister and principal opposition leader Yair Lapid has said, "We are headed for disaster." Even the Biden administration in the United States has repeatedly spoken out against Netanyahu's government and its overhaul plan. President Joe Biden had said, given the range of threats and challenges confronting Israel right now, it doesn't make sense for Israeli leaders to rush this. The focus should be on pulling people together and finding a consensus. Critics say the new law would be a major stain on Israel's claim to be a liberal democracy. The overhaul calls for sweeping changes that are aimed at curbing the powers of the judiciary, whether it is limiting the Supreme Court's ability to challenge parliamentary decisions or changing the way judges are selected. Netanyahu and his allies say the changes are needed to curb the powers of unelected judges. Protesters who come from a wide swath of Israeli society see the overhaul as a power grab fueled by Netanyahu's personal and political grievances. Remember, he's on trial for corruption charges. Critics of the legislation argue that it would significantly diminish the powers of the Supreme Court and grant the ruling coalition excessive influence in appointing judges and even overruling unfavorable verdicts from the court. The law aims to take away the Supreme Court's power to strike down Israel's basic laws, which function as the country's constitution. This power to review the legality of laws is similar to the power of judicial review vested with Indian courts. The law also allows the government of Israel to choose judges by altering the composition of a 9-member committee that selects judges. Protesters say the power of the Supreme Court to review or set aside laws will now be significantly weakened with a simple majority of just one in the Knesset. That means the government would be able to overrule any court decision which is unpalatable to it. Additionally, ministers would not be required to obey the advice of their legal advisors guided by the Attorney General, something that was the case up until now. Earlier this year, another controversial reform had already been passed, removing the power of the Attorney General to pronounce a sitting Prime Minister unfit for office. There was speculation that the Attorney General was preparing to do exactly that with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu due to a conflict of interest between these judicial reforms and the Prime Minister's ongoing trial for alleged corruption. Critics say Netanyahu wants to leverage the judicial reforms to cancel his own trial, an accusation the Prime Minister denies. The ruling coalition in Israel also views the judiciary as a left-leaning obstacle to its legislative agenda. Netanyahu's government has claimed that Israelis have lost faith in the legal system and its reform plans would restore power to the elected representatives instead of interventionist and unelected judges. The question is, what does this judicial overhaul mean for Israel's judiciary, its political class and its society? More importantly, what does it mean for the country's democracy? Will it mean the end of all checks and balances and government's accountability, as the critics argue? Will this law impinge on Israeli citizens' civil liberties? Is it going to set Israel on the path of authoritarianism?
I feel very sad. I feel very big disappointment from our government. I think that it's not listening to the people, it's not listening to what the street says, and they're following their own ego, and it's very, very disappointing. On the other hand, I feel a lot of hope from everything that's happening here with all the people that came to all the demonstrations.
He divided the people. He's held by the extremes, and he does nothing for the people, only for himself and for his friends.
I think this country is going to either split into two countries or be finished altogether.
I think it will continue until we feel it's necessary, until people feel safe and secure that we have enough freedom to do this. And we will only stop until we feel like we've achieved what we came here to do, which is either make a difference or open people's mind.
It's a little terrifying, but I think we're holding out hope that the situation doesn't escalate to become worse, but it's also hard to see the situation in a very optimistic light. And I mean, I think all of this is only evidence that people aren't going to give up just yet, and just because the campsite itself is being taken down doesn't mean that the fight itself is going to stop, and I don't think citizens here are planning to stop anytime soon.
All right, so what do these controversial judicial reforms really mean for the future of Israel? That is the burning question that currently faces the Israeli people. We have a terrific panel joining us live from Israel tonight to put into perspective this entire issue and the raging controversy of these judicial reforms. I'm joined tonight by Gilad Kariv, a member of the Knesset, that's the Israeli parliament. He belongs to the Israel Labour Party. We also have with us Professor Yaniv Roznai, co-director of the Rubinstein Center for Constitutional Law at the Reichman University, and completing the panel tonight is Dafna Maor, global editor with TheMarker. Thank you so much to all three of you for joining us. Gilad Kariv, let me start with you. Now, we've seen how Israel has been rocked by nationwide protests since the beginning of this year, but clearly that has made absolutely no difference to the Prime Minister and his government of far-right parties who have decided to press ahead with these controversial judicial reforms. Why do the protesters and the opposition believe that these reforms are setting Israel on the path to dictatorship? Why do you believe that these reforms are dangerous for Israel?
So first of all, good evening and shalom from Jerusalem. Let me start by saying that I strongly believe that this glorified democratic protest definitely succeeded to block the operation of Netanyahu's coalition. Without this process, the judicial queue would have been fully completed. And only because hundreds of thousands of Israelis are marching in the streets for the last 6 months, we succeeded to delay major elements of this reform. And I strongly believe that the only way to block Netanyahu's desires to weaken the Israeli judicial branch is by continuing with this protest. Now, addressing your question, we need to remember that Israel has a strong and vibrant democracy, but in many ways, this is a thin democracy. We do not have a sophisticated or well-developed system of checks and balances for different historic reasons. One example is the fact that we have only one house in our parliament, although we followed the British model. And I can give many other examples to this analysis that while we have a strong democracy, we don't have many sufficient elements of this democratic concept of checks and balances. And Netanyahu's desire is to remove the power of the most efficient mechanism that we have, and that is the judicial, constitutional, and administrative overrule authority. And they are doing it without suggesting any alternative mechanisms. So it is quite clear that the main goal of this reform is not to amend the Israeli political and constitutional structure. It is all about giving more powers to the executive branch and lowering the constitutional and legal restrictions over the actions of this very strong branch of government.
Interesting. You are saying this has nothing to do with reforming the judiciary. This is all about giving more powers to the executive. But before I go across to the others on the panel, Mr. Kariv, I have to ask you this. This particular bill was passed in the Knesset on Monday by a 64-0 vote. Now, I know that the opposition lawmakers walked out in protest, but the question is that if you are so strongly opposed to this legislation, people have been, protesting on the streets of Israel for the last 6 months, then why should the opposition not vote against the legislation? Why walk out? Why allow the government to ramrod a controversial legislation like this through by a 64-0 vote?
The only reason why we walked out the Knesset plenary was in order to send a very strong message that it is not only the content of the legislation which is disturbing, it's also the procedure. One of our main claims was and still is that when you try to lead constitutional reforms, and this is definitely the largest and deepest constitutional reform Israel ever experienced, when you are leading a constitutional reform, you need to do it very carefully. You need to lead a sincere attempt to build a wide political and social consensus, because we are not talking about the daily routine of the government. We are talking about the ground rules of the Israeli democracy. And third, we need to follow the procedures of the Israeli parliament and to fully respect them. And unfortunately, this government and this coalition are violating the most important procedural norms of the Israeli parliament. And the way to tell the Israeli audience that we are not only against the legislation, but we also think it's not legitimate under democratic terms, was to walk out the plenary. And I think that 64 versus 0 presents this message in a much stronger way than 64 versus 56.
All right. You are saying that you chose to register your protest by walking out rather than voting against this legislation. Let me now get a word in from Dafna Maor. Ms. Maor, you would agree that the kind of protests that we've seen in Israel since the beginning of this year have exposed unprecedented fissures in Israeli society. Now, the government and other supporters of this legislation say that unelected judges have had excessive powers over decision making by elected officials that needed to be checked and corrected. However, critics of the government say that essentially this is going to end all judicial oversight and government accountability. There are going to be no checks and balances. This is going to pave the way for more corruption and improper appointments. And the protesters have gone as far as to say that the very foundations of Israel are being eroded by the Netanyahu government and his far-right allies. How do you see this debate that's raging in Israel?
So for 75 years, Israel has been, it was born a democracy around the same time as India. And for 75 years, including Netanyahu's previous governments, we had a social political contract between the public, the people of Israel, and its government and governing establishment, that it will be a liberal democracy. And in the last election, the current government won by a very narrow margin, a few thousand votes, without telling their voters, those parties, without telling their voters that they're going for this coup, for this overhaul. So breaking the social contract, as Gilad said, needs changing the social contract, needs a broad agreement, and there is no broad agreement as we see. I have to say something to understand why Israelis are protesting for 27 weeks with such devotion and energy and putting their lives on hold. You have to look into these 75 years. The majority of people agreed to things that in most countries would be considered not so normal, to live under war and rockets. And we have the highest cost of living in the developed world. We have army service which is mandatory without pay. And we accept all these things in order to keep alive this project that is called Israel, and which has been very successful. It had its faults. No one says it's perfect. We live with religious dictates. We don't have public transportation on Saturday, for example. But the people have had enough, because this government is not only changing the rules, it is very dysfunctional. And it's breaking, as you mentioned, the social fabric of Israel. And we've had enough. They've had enough. Most people have had enough. And so if you want to ask why is it so, why people are protesting so hard, you have to look into the reasons that this overhaul is being done. We have a very weak prime minister under serious indictments, criminal indictments, that is seeking to find his way out of conviction and out of prison. And this weak prime minister is letting his coalition partners, which are the most extreme parties ever to be part of the Israeli government, to basically blackmail him into two things. The first is corruption, base monetary corruption, taking as much as budgets as possible for their own interests. And the second thing is more ideological. We have people who truly believe that they want to take away the court's powers and to annex it to the government in order to change the basic rule of law in Israel. And these are the reasons. And the argument about the judiciary versus the legislative branch and the government, I think it's more a cover for what is going on now. So this is the reason the protest is so vehement. And the government's rationalization is just a smokescreen.
All right. So what happens next? Because clearly the people are refusing to go back home, but it seems the government is not listening. However, Professor Yaniv Roznai, here's the irony. While the protesters and all the critics of this legislation say that it is eroding Israel's democracy, the Prime Minister, in his address to the nation on Monday, says, fulfilling the will of the voters is by no means the end of democracy. It is the essence of democracy. The passage of this law was a necessary democratic move. How do you respond to that? And I also want to ask you this question that I put to Gilad Kariv. Do you not believe the opposition would have made its point better by actually voting against this bill rather than by walking out in protest?
So thank you very much for having me. And responding to Prime Minister Netanyahu, I think that this bill will be good for democracy, just as smoking cigarettes is good for your health. This amendment, in a way, undermines checks and balances. It weakens gatekeepers. It provides more power to the executive. Basically, the government they don't feel confident with these limitations that they have to act in a reasonable manner, so they're removing it. Who assures us that the next stage would not be removing proportionality or conflict of interest? And I think that the big problem is that the ministers and the government, they themselves are telling us that this is merely the amuse-bouche, the salads that would open the appetite for the rest of the judicial overhaul. And unfortunately, we, the citizens, are the buffet. And I think this is the main risk. This bill that was enacted yesterday, some will say that is a minor thing, just limiting administrative review. However, it is precisely this bill that would allow constitutional capture, that would allow weakening gatekeepers. And this, in turn, would allow the government to continue with their judicial overhaul in a much more, in an easier manner, so to speak. But it's not the end of the story, because various petitions were submitted to the court. And now there is the question whether the court will adopt Indian-style basic structure doctrine when it's reviewing this amendment. Of course, there is no doubt that this amendment violates rights. The only question is whether it undermines the core values of the state as a democratic state. And I think the biggest task here for the court is to look at the big picture. Because if they would analyze each coming amendment on its own, they might miss the forest by focusing on the trees. And we know nowadays that democracies die in an incremental manner and subtle manner. So I think they would have to look at the big picture and put the red line already at the beginning in a militant democracy style. I hope they will do so.